unfold.
Welcome to the deep dive. If you are listening to this, you're probably someone who, understands the power of information and the devastating pain of losing it. Today, we are taking on the supreme archetype of that loss, the Great Library of Alexandria. The popular image we all carry is, well, it's simple, traumatic, and catastrophic.
It is.
All the world's secrets going up in a single tragic inferno.
And that image is potent, almost cinematic, but it is also profoundly misleading. The story of the library's death is not one of a single swift execution.
Right.
It is the story of a long, slow decay, a complex, protracted process of attrition that really spans centuries. We need to move past the myth to understand what actually happened.
Okay, so let's unpack this central legend. The idea that the library was destroyed in one night has given rise to what scholars call the setback of civilization theory.
Right.
The claim is that because the library contained the definitive text on everything from steam power to complex gearing and advanced mathematics, its sudden disappearance locked away those crucial blueprints.
And delayed the Industrial Revolution.
By nearly 2,000 years, civilization just pressed the pause button.
It's an intoxicating idea, that historical what if, but to attribute that subsequent stagnation solely to a single pile of burnt scrolls, it simplifies the profound economic and structural barriers that already existed in the ancient world.
Okay.
The loss was immense, yes, but its immediate impact on technology was surprisingly negligible.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We are going beyond the narrative of smoke and flame. We're going to run a forensic timeline on the library's demise, showing it was a death by 1,000 cuts.
Fueled by neglect, shifting priorities, war.
And crucially, we need to hold up that setback hypothesis to the harsh light of economic history. I mean, if the ancients had steam engines, why did they remain merely toys?
That's the key question.
But we have to examine the socioeconomic context, specifically, the overwhelming presence of slave labor that made these revolutionary ancient technologies economically irrelevant to the people in charge.
And we'll explore the specific genius of figures like Heron of Alexandria and the astonishing complexity of the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐓 mechanism, just to demonstrate that the technical knowledge did exist.
Right.
And then we'll pivot, discussing the staggering theoretical losses, the true cosmology and advanced mathematics that vanished, before concluding with a truly paradoxical twist.
Which is what?
How 21st century science is now digitally excavating and resurrecting these very texts we thought were lost forever.
That is a fascinating scope. Let's start where the myth often fails, by defining what this institution actually was. It wasn't just a municipal public library, was it?
No, not at all. It was the intellectual engine of a superpower.
Okay, let's get into it.
We have to understand that the Great Library was merely the textual repository, the archive. It was the textual cortex of a much larger state-sponsored and continuously funded research institute, the Mauschin.
The Temple of the Muses.
Exactly. The distinction is absolutely critical.
And this was founded in the 3rd century BCE, right? So right at the dawn of the Hellenistic Age, by Ptolemy I Soter.
One of Alexander the Great's generals who had seized control of Egypt. It was then expanded significantly by his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus.
So what drove them to dedicate so much resource to this project? I mean, it must have been astronomically expensive.
It was. The motivation was really twofold: cultural supremacy and political legitimacy. The Ptolemies were foreign rulers, Macedonian Greeks governing an ancient Egyptian civilization.
So they needed to prove themselves.
They needed to legitimize their rule, and to do that, they had to establish Alexandria as the new, undisputed capital of the Hellenistic intellectual world. They had to eclipse Athens.
And how do you do that?
Their goal was monumental. They decreed they would collect every book ever written, making Alexandria the universal knowledge hub.
It wasn't just about possession then. It was about authority. They wanted to hold the definitive, authoritative copy of every major text, positioning themselves as the ultimate arbiters of the Greek intellectual tradition.
Precisely. They poured unprecedented resources into this, subsidizing what was effectively an entire intellectual city-state within the royal quarter.
Which brings us directly to their acquisition strategy. I've read about this, and it was aggressive, to say the least.
That's putting it mildly. It was ruthless. This is encapsulated by the Tuplion Decree, the books from ships policy.
This policy is a perfect illustration of their ambition, isn't it? They didn't wait for donations. They literally seized the texts.
According to the medical writer Galen, royal agents were strategically placed at the deep water harbor, the Portus Magnus, and they had the authority of the crown to search every single incoming vessel.
Every ship.
Every ship. If scrolls were discovered, they were immediately confiscated and transported to the library for official processing by the resident scholars.
And the processing was where the ethics, by modern standards, completely collapsed. They didn't just borrow or copy them respectfully.
No, they engaged in what we can only call state-sanctioned intellectual property theft. Scribes would create extremely high-quality, lavishly produced copies of the confiscated texts. However, the library, prioritizing textual purity and authority, often retained the original manuscripts, deeming them the most authentic versions.
And they gave the copies back.
They returned the newly minted copies to the ship's master, sometimes with compensation, but often simply by fiat. Here's your book back, thanks for the original.
The very fact that they labeled these books from the ships, 𝐏𝐻𝐃, confirms that they were aware of the difference, right, between these acquired texts and their core collection.
Oh, absolutely. They were obsessive about having the autograph copies, or at least the earliest possible versions. It was a very sophisticated understanding of textual criticism.
Oh, so?
They understood that every act of copying introduced potential errors, scribal slips, omissions, interpolations. By acquiring the earliest available manuscript, they ensured that their version became the standard canonical edition for the entire Hellenistic world.
The famous example of Ptolemy III Euergetes and the Athenian tragedies really drives home the high financial stakes involved in this.
It's a spectacular anecdote. It tells you everything you need to know about their mindset. Athens held the official, authoritative state copies of the foundational Greek tragedies, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, sacred texts.
Originals.
The state originals. Ptolemy III petitioned Athens to borrow these under the pretense of having them copied and collated in Alexandria.
And Athens was, I assume, a little reluctant.
Very. To guarantee their return, he put up a massive sum of money as collateral. 15 talents of silver.
15 talents. Now, to put that into perspective for you, historians estimate that 15 talents could buy a medium-sized fleet of warships or fund the construction of a small temple.
It was an enormous, perhaps intentionally prohibitive dond.
And he forfeited it.
He forfeited it. Ptolemy III kept the original Athenian manuscripts, the sacred texts of Greek civilization, and sent the beautiful new copies back to Athens. He effectively purchased the authoritative versions at an astronomical cost.
That's intellectual warfare carried out with the resources of an empire.
It is.
So once these scholars had secured their texts, what was the actual Mautian environment like? Strabo the geographer visited decades after the Ptolemies fell to Rome, and he described something that sounds much closer to a modern, fully subsidized university campus than just a building full of scrolls.
Strabo's account is crucial. He situates the Mautian centrally within the Bruchion, the royal quarter, which indicates its high status and physical connection to the center of power.
It was right next to the palaces.
And it wasn't designed for silence. It was designed for constant, structured conversation and collaborative living.
Tell us about the physical infrastructure. What was it designed to do?
Well, the physical layout mirrored the great philosophical schools of Athens. You had the Peripatos, a covered, colonnaded walkway modeled directly after Aristotle's Lyceum, specifically built for peripatetic discussion.
So scholars literally walked and talked their way through philosophical problems.
That was the idea. Then you had the Exedra, a large hall or arcade equipped with benches used for formal lectures, public debates, seminars.
It sounds like an intentional design choice to ensure different experts, a philologist, an astronomer, a physician, would literally bump into each other and exchange ideas constantly.
That was the genius of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And this interaction continued beyond the lecture halls. Central to the Mautian was the oikos, the large communal dining hall.
They ate together.
The scholars, referred to often as philogoi, or men of learning, shared their meals there, continuing intense discussions late into the evening.
And the scholars were utterly insulated from external pressures thanks to royal funding.
Completely subsidized, they received substantial royal stipends, effectively research grants, that freed them from needing external employment. They were provided free lodging, tax exemptions, and even servants.
Wow.
I mean, think of the intellectual benefit of having figures like Euclid, the father of geometry, Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference, Callimachus, the great bibliographer, all living, eating, and arguing within the same complex for years on end.
It must have created an intensity of intellectual labor rarely seen before or since.
And the research was holistic. It wasn't just scrolls. Strabo mentions actual scientific infrastructure.
Right. This is important.
Yes, the empirical aspect was essential. The Mauschin included functioning astronomical observatories, elaborate botanical gardens for pharmaceutical and biological study, and even a zoo for exotic animals, which facilitated comparative anatomy and biological research.
So it was a commitment to both textual knowledge and empirical observation.
It was a complete ecosystem of knowledge.
This aggressive acquisition and subsidized labor naturally led to the information management crisis you mentioned. If the collection was between 40,000 and potentially 500,000 scrolls, a vast number, how did they prevent it from becoming an unusable, unnavigable mess?
They solved it with a monumental piece of organizational genius. The 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓.
The tables.
Compiled by 𝐏𝐿𝐴𝐃𝐂𝐒𝐓 of Cyrene, the chief librarian. This was a 120-volume work. And we need to be clear, this was not a simple card catalog. It was a comprehensive, critical bibliographic survey.
A 120-volume index. That alone speaks to the scale.
Yeah.
How did 𝐏𝐿𝐴𝐃𝐂𝐒𝐓 even structure this groundbreaking work?
He classified the entire collection by genre epic, dramatic, lyric, history, rhetoric, law, medicine, mathematics, and then cataloged all the authors within each genre, noting the scrolls they had written.
Okay, that makes sense.
But critically, the entry for each work included biographical data on the author, a precise list of their works, often with scroll counts, and the incipits.
Incipits, the first few lines of a text. Why was that detail so essential?
It was foundational to ancient textual criticism. Because scrolls didn't have uniform covers or title pages, and many works shared similar names, the incipit allowed scholars to definitively distinguish between two different manuscripts with similar titles, verify the completeness of a scroll, and ensure accuracy.
It transformed a chaotic mass of material into a scientifically managed database.
It was the world's first.
And here is where the immediate intellectual tragedy of the library's decline begins, well before the physical buildings were destroyed. The loss of the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐓 itself.
The loss is incalculable. It is an intellectual catastrophe of statistical erasure. Because the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐓 listed every single author and title collected, its disappearance means we don't just mourn the loss of the texts of Aeschylus or Euclid. Right. We mourn the loss of the knowledge that thousands of other authors even existed.
You mean authors who are never cited anywhere else, or whose work was too niche or too early to be referenced by later writers?
Precisely. For example, we might only possess 3 surviving works on rhetoric, but the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐓 might have listed 20 authors who wrote on the topic. We know nothing of those 17 others.
Wow.
The 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐓 was the master index to a lost literary universe. Its destruction means that the entire historical record of Greek thought is structurally incomplete, and we don't even know the extent of that incompleteness. We can only infer it.
That statistical erasure brings us directly to the end of the Mauschin. We have to now turn our attention to the timeline of its demise and address that single-fire myth head-on.
Yes. When you look at the source material, the idea that the library burned in a single night, whether by Caesar in 48 BCE or the Arabs in 642 CE, is a comforting simplification.
It's a clean narrative.
It is, but the sources demonstrate a 700-year process of incremental, devastating loss.
So let's start with the event most often cited as the definitive end, the Caesarean fire of 48 BCE. What was the context? Why was Julius Caesar in Alexandria in the first place?
Caesar arrived unexpectedly. He was drawn into the bloody dynastic civil war between the young Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra.
And he got trapped.
He found himself besieged in the royal quarter, cut off by the Egyptian fleet. To protect himself and his forces, he ordered a drastic military action in the harbor.
He burned the ships.
He ordered the ships in the harbor burned to prevent the Egyptian fleet from using them. Ancient historians, most notably Plutarch and Seneca, who were relying on earlier sources like Livy, report that the fire spread from the docks to the apothecae, the warehouses, and destroyed a large number of texts.
And the number cited is 40,000 scrolls, right?
Livy cites 40,000 scrolls lost in this incident. 40,000 sounds devastating, but historians have long argued that this was not the main core collection of the Mauschin.
Which was housed further inland.
Exactly, further inland within the royal quarter complex. The modern consensus is that those 40,000 scrolls were most likely bulk storage.
What does that mean, bulk storage?
Perhaps surplus copies, export texts awaiting shipment, or most likely the most recent acquisitions from the books from ships policy that were still awaiting processing and cataloging outside the secure central library building.
Okay, so a major loss, but not the whole thing. And the definitive proof that the institution itself survived comes from Strabo, whom we just mentioned.
Correct. Strabo was traveling and writing decades after Caesar's fire, visiting Alexandria around 20 BCE. He wrote about the Moutian in the present tense. He described its covered walkways, the dining halls, the stipends for scholars.
So it was still a going concern.
It was still functionally operational. The institution had undoubtedly suffered a major blow to its collection and vitality, but it was still there. Caesar's fire was the first major trauma, but it was not the death blow.
So if Caesar is exonerated as the killer, the true, most likely culprit for the physical destruction of the main library building is far less famous. The Emperor Aurelian.
Aurelian. This is during the incredibly tumultuous crisis of the 3rd century, around 270 to 275 CE. The empire was fracturing. At this time, Alexandria was seized by the forces of Queen Zenobia of the breakaway Palmyrene Empire.
And Rome, under Aurelian, launched a massive reconquest campaign to reclaim the vital grain supplies of Egypt.
The fighting in Alexandria was particularly brutal. Aurelian's forces engaged in prolonged street warfare, and the emperor ordered the systematic leveling of the entire Bruttian district, the royal quarter.
So not an accident this time.
Not an accident. This was a military strategy to suppress the insurrection and regain control of the city. This was total destruction. Unlike Caesar's accidental spread from the docks, this was the systematic razing of the quarter where the Moutian and the library were originally situated.
So if the monumental library structure still stood in its original location by the mid-3rd century CE,
and records suggest the institution was already suffering from dwindling state support and scholarly dispersal,
then it almost certainly perished completely in Aurelian's firestorm.
that event marks the end of the library as a central, comprehensive, physical entity.
And the scholarly community, fragmented and relying on secondary collections, suffered a final institutional blow just over a century later.
Yes, the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE. This was the daughter library, which housed an estimated 42,000 scrolls.
And by the late Roman period, it had become a critical center for pagan learning and philosophy, especially after the original Moutian was lost.
It had. This occurred under Patriarch Theophilus, following Emperor Theodosius I's edicts against pagan practices.
And Theophilus led a Christian mob against the Serapeum.
He did. The attack resulted in the demolition of the magnificent temple and the destruction of the colossal statue of Serapis. The historical records, like those from Socrates Scholasticus, confirm that the scrolls housed there were either looted, destroyed, or deliberately burned by the mob.
And that marks the definitive end of the public library system in Alexandria.
There was no longer any large, state-sponsored, or publicly accessible collection of classical texts left in the city. Knowledge devolved entirely to smaller, scattered private collections, clandestine philosophical schools, and later monastic centers. The institution was gone.
Now we can finally address the most persistent historical error, the Caliph Omar story from 642 CE. Why does this myth endure so strongly?
It's a compelling, clean narrative that serves rhetorical purposes. The story claims that when the Arab army captured Alexandria, the commander asked Caliph Omar what to do with the vast collection of books.
And Omar allegedly replied,
Famously, if the books agree with the Quran, they are superfluous and need not be preserved, and if they disagree, they are pernicious and should be destroyed.
and so he ordered them burned.
He supposedly ordered them burned to heat the city's numerous bathhouses for 6 months.
And the historical verdict on this story?
Historians are virtually unanimous. It is a fabrication. The account does not appear in any contemporary sources from the 7th or 8th centuries. Its first significant appearance is nearly 600 years later.
600 years?
In the 13th century, cited by authors like the Syriac Christian scholar Barhibarus, it was likely developed much later to frame the Islamic conquest in a certain political or ideological light.
So what was the reality on the ground in 642?
The historical reality is that the Great Library had vanished for over 3 centuries in Aurelian's fire, and the Serapeum had been destroyed for 251 years. The conquering Arabs found a city already intellectually impoverished, stripped of its great institutional libraries. They didn't burn the library. They inherited a ruin.
So, to summarize our forensic finding, the library's death was a marathon, not a sprint, a centuries-long collapse. And that complexity is vital because it brings us back to the setback theory. If the core knowledge was still demonstrably around in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Why didn't it spark an industrial revolution then?
This is the core paradox that fascinates historians and engineers alike. We have undeniable proof, in the form of surviving texts and physical artifacts, that the ancient Greeks, particularly those connected to the Mauson, possessed the theoretical blueprints for an industrial age.
And the primary evidence comes from Heron of Alexandria. He lived around 10 to 70 CE, right at the beginning of the Roman imperial period, teaching at what was left of the Mauson.
His surviving treatises, especially Pneumatica and Mechanica, describe machines that just, well, they shouldn't exist in that time frame.
So let's start with the revolutionary concept, the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐓. It's universally considered the world's first recorded steam engine, even if it was intended as a novelty.
It was.
Describe the mechanism for us. How did this ancient device convert heat into usable rotary motion?
The 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐓, named after Aeolus, the Greek god of wind, was essentially a radial reaction turbine. It comprised a sealed kettle or cauldron, which heated water to produce steam. The steam then traveled up pipes into a hollow spherical vessel mounted on bearings.
Okay, I can picture that.
Then the steam escaped the sphere through two or more L-shaped nozzles angled tangentially to the sphere's circumference.
And Newton's third law, action and reaction, takes over from there.
Correct. The rapid expulsion of steam from the angled nozzles created a reactive thrust, generating torque, and causing the sphere to spin rapidly on its axis. The principle is pure thermodynamics and mechanics. It demonstrated that thermal energy could be efficiently harnessed to produce continuous, predictable rotary motion.
Which is a fundamental requirement for industrial machinery.
Exactly.
But Heron's genius wasn't limited to steam. His other inventions show a profound grasp of automation, feedback loops, and precision mechanics that you typically associate with the late Renaissance or the early Enlightenment.
Take the famous example, the world's first documented coin-operated machine.
A vending machine.
A vending machine for holy water. This was an elegant application of weight and balance.
Walk us through the mechanics of that.
A worshiper would insert a coin, a relatively heavy bronze or silver piece, into a slot. The coin would fall onto a small pan or lever connected to a valve mechanism inside the device. The weight of the coin tilted the lever downward, briefly opening the valve, which allowed a measured amount of holy water to flow out. As the pan tilted further, the coin would then slide off into a receptacle.
And the valve would close.
Once the weight was removed, a strategically placed counterweight would snap the lever back, instantly closing the valve and stopping the flow of water.
That is a perfect example of a closed-loop control system. Input, the coin, yields a specific output, the water, and the system automatically resets itself.
It proves an advanced understanding of automation and practical physics. Then consider his automatic temple doors, which were purely theatrical but relied on complex pneumatics.
How did Heron's mechanism make those enormous temple doors open, seemingly by magic, for the congregation?
It was a beautiful display of exploiting thermal expansion. A fire would be lit on the altar outside the temple. Beneath the altar was a sealed bronze chamber connected by pipes to a vessel filled with water.
Okay.
The heat from the fire caused the air in the chamber to rapidly expand, forcing the water out of the vessel and into a large weighted bucket.
Ah, so the bucket gets heavier.
As the bucket filled, its increasing weight pulled on a series of ropes wound around the spindles of the heavy bronze doors, causing them to slowly swing open. When the fire was extinguished, the air cooled and contracted, siphoning the water back, and counterweights would swing the doors shut.
The knowledge base for mechanical automation was there. But the evidence of high-precision engineering is most spectacularly confirmed by the 𝐏𝐃𝐂𝐃 mechanism. This artifact changes the way we view ancient capabilities entirely.
The 𝐏𝐃𝐂𝐃 mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera, dating from around 150 to 100 BC, is nothing less than a clockwork universe. It was a shoebox-sized device made of wood and bronze, containing at least 30 intricately meshing bronze gears.
This was the world's first known complex analog computer. What exactly was it built to calculate?
Its complexity was dedicated to astronomy and calendrics. It had dial displays on the front and back, designed to predict the positions of the sun, the moon, and likely the 5 known planets against the zodiac.
And eclipses too, right?
Critically, it could calculate the timing of lunar and solar eclipses using the sophisticated 18-year Saros cycle. It also tracked the timing of major Panhellenic games, like the Olympics.
We're talking about pre-calculator, pre-digital computation performed mechanically.
Yeah.
But the most astounding technical detail is how it modeled the irregular path of the moon.
The moon's orbital speed is variable. It accelerates when closer to Earth at perigee and slows down when further away at apogee. This is related to what we now call Kepler's second law.
And the mechanism modeled that.
It did, using an advanced differential gear assembly called the pin and slot epicyclic gear train.
How does that specific gear train translate that abstract orbital physics into physical motion?
The gear train included one gear that rotated slightly eccentrically or off-center. A pin fixed to this eccentric gear slid back and forth within a slot carved into another gear. As the eccentric gear rotated, the pin and slot movement mechanically sped up or slowed down the output gear at precise points in the cycle.
Mirroring the moon's variable velocity.
Exactly. It's a physical realization of a highly abstract mathematical concept requiring high-precision metallurgy and machining built centuries before Christ.
The implication is stunning. This device proves the existence of a mature tradition of sophisticated gear cutting and clockwork technology. The technical gap is what's sobering.
It is. We don't see this level of mechanical complexity reappear in the historical record until the sophisticated astronomical clocks of 14th century Europe.
So we have the blueprints. Steam power, automation, complex gearing. The knowledge existed, and it was certainly known in the Alexandrian intellectual sphere. Why, then, did the Industrial Revolution not happen in 100 CE instead of 1700 CE?
This is where we apply the economic lens. The information was present, but the structure required to deploy it was absent. The great economic historian Moses Finley articulated this brilliantly.
What was his argument?
He argued that the barrier was not informational, but structural and economic. These amazing devices were ingenious toys because the market incentives for efficiency simply did not exist.
And the single biggest structural barrier comes down to human capital, or rather, the cost of human labor.
Precisely. The endemic, ubiquitous presence of cheap slave labor fundamentally depressed the economic incentive for large-scale technological investment.
Right.
Think about it from a factory owner's perspective, even if they had a functional steam engine. Why invest enormous capital in designing, manufacturing, installing, and critically fueling a steam engine when a slave could perform the same labor for a fraction of the cost?
The return on investment for innovation was literally negative. A slave cost less than the wood and charcoal required to run the fuel-hungry steam engine for a prolonged period.
The ancient economy optimized around minimizing capital expenditure, not maximizing labor efficiency. Furthermore, the elite wealth structure was fundamentally anti-industrial.
A status economy.
The ruling class, the senators, the landowners, derived their status and wealth from land ownership, military conquest, and political office. They considered manufacturing, engineering, and trade as low-status, vulgar occupations.
So the people with the money, the capital, saw no honor or economic benefit in scaling up these inventions.
None. The elite sought prestige in building temples or writing philosophy, not in running a textile mill. The system was designed to reward land, not productivity.
And even if we ignore the slavery issue and the status economy, they had a significant technological bottleneck that Heron himself couldn't solve: the material science.
Yes, metallurgy was the Achilles heel. While Heron demonstrated the principle of the steam engine, scaling the alopile into a factory-grade engine required high-quality cast iron or steel capable of containing high-pressure steam boilers.
And they didn't have that.
Ancient metalworking simply lacked the sophistication and consistency needed to forge these high-pressure containers safely and reliably. Without that material science, any attempt to build an industrial engine risked catastrophe-exploding boilers,
making it unsuitable for widespread application. And finally, the question of fuel supply. The European Industrial Revolution was powered by deep coal mining. Where would the ancient world have found the energy?
Fuel scarcity was a massive logistical and ecological barrier. The ancient world relied almost entirely on wood and charcoal. Industrializing with steam power requires prodigious sustained energy output.
And Egypt doesn't have forests.
No. Egypt and the Mediterranean lacked the deep, easily accessible coal deposits of places like northern England. A massive, fuel-hungry industrial economy was simply not ecologically sustainable given their energy technology. They would have deforested their entire region attempting to run a single factory district.
And lastly, the structure of innovation itself. The lack of intellectual property laws.
Absolutely. The absence of patents or licensing protection meant that inventors often viewed their mechanisms as trade secrets, ways to secure private patronage or a unique theatrical effect.
Like Heron's temple doors.
Exactly. He kept those secrets private. This structural secrecy prevented the cumulative, collaborative, and rapid technological diffusion necessary to bridge the gap from a singular invention like the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓 mechanism to a mature industrial sector.
So the knowledge was irrelevant because the economic engine of the ancient world ran on human muscle, not coal.
That's the bottom line.
If the industrial loss was structural, the theoretical loss of the pure science contained in the Mausen was absolute. And this is where the loss truly set civilization back, forcing a reinvention of basic concepts a millennium and a half later.
The grandest conceptual loss must be the true model of the cosmos. The library was the repository of the complete works of Aristarchus of Samos, who lived in the 3rd century BC.
And Aristarchus was the first person we know of to propose a comprehensive, heliocentric model of the solar system, the sun at the center.
His treatise proposed that the Earth revolves around the sun, and that the fixed stars remain unmoved. This was revolutionary thinking. The tragic loss is that his original treatise containing the mathematical proofs and complete physical arguments is entirely gone.
We only know he proposed this model because of a single crucial reference by Archimedes in his work The Sand Reckoner.
That reference is our lifeline. Archimedes was writing to explain large numbers, but he referenced Aristarchus to show the scale of the universe they were discussing. He explicitly writes that Aristarchus hypothesized that the fixed stars in the sun remain unmoved, that the Earth revolves about the sun in the circumference of a circle.
So the idea survived, but the proof was lost.
The loss of the original proofs meant that the entire intellectual defense of heliocentrism was gone. The primary scientific objection at the time was the lack of observable stellar parallax. If the Earth was moving, the stars should appear to shift.
Right, and they couldn't see it.
And Aristarchus had already correctly hypothesized the solution. The stars were simply too distant for the parallax shift to be detectable with ancient instruments. With the loss of his mathematical text, this crucial defense vanished.
Which allowed the geocentric model, later formalized by Ptolemy, to become the unchallenged authority for 1,500 years.
Delaying the work of Copernicus until the 16th century.
Speaking of astronomy, the loss of Hipparchus's work, the great astronomer of the 2nd century BC, the father of trigonometry, was mourned for millennia. But a major discovery in 2022 fundamentally shifted our understanding of this loss.
It did. Historians had long suspected that Hipparchus's legendary star catalog, a crucial record of the positions and brightness of hundreds of fixed stars, was simply lost, or worse, that it had been plagiarized and corrupted within Ptolemy's Almagest.
The Almagest was the textbook for centuries.
It was the only surviving text for much of the Middle Ages, shaping Islamic and European astronomy. But the 2022 revelation, using multispectral imaging on a palimpsest called the 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒 rescriptus, allowed researchers to recover previously erased fragments of Hipparchus's original calculations.
And what did they find?
The discovery was astonishing. It proved that Hipparchus's measurements of celestial coordinates were accurate to within 1 degree of arc.
And what was the implication regarding Ptolemy?
The forensic data proved 2 things. First, that Hipparchus was a far more precise observational astronomer than previously believed. Second, and critically, it proved that Ptolemy did not simply copy or perfect Hipparchus's catalog, but often used less accurate or more derivative data in his Almagest.
So the science didn't just stand still. It actively regressed after Hipparchus's peak. The zenith of ancient observational astronomy was lost and replaced by a slightly inferior work that became canonical.
A powerful realization about how scientific knowledge can decline even when superficially preserved. The same story holds true in mathematics. Euclid's Elements survived, fortunately, but his advanced work on projective geometry did not.
We're talking about Euclid's porisms, a collection of theorems beyond his basic geometric principles.
The porisms contained 171 advanced theorems related to projective geometry, dealing with concepts like perspective and invariant properties under projection. This represents a very high level of abstract geometric thought.
And the loss of that text meant that this line of mathematical inquiry was just severed.
We only know of its content today through a brief, confusing summary provided by the later mathematician Pappus of Alexandria. That high level of geometric abstraction was not fully replicated or understood in the West until the 19th century, when mathematicians like Michel Chelles tried to reconstruct them based on those vague surviving summaries.
We lost 1,500 years of mathematical development in that single area. Finally, let's look at the medical eclipse. Alexandria held a unique legal and cultural advantage in the medical sphere under the early Ptolemies.
A huge advantage. Alexandria was the only place in the classical world where human vivisection and detailed dissection were briefly permitted, practiced by brilliant physicians like Herophilus and Erastratus in the 3rd century BCE.
Which was a radical departure from the taboos elsewhere. What did that empirical access allow them to discover?
Foundational discoveries. Herophilus correctly identified the brain, not the heart, as the center of the nervous system and intelligence. They distinguished between sensory and motor nerves. They understood the function of the heart valves and the difference between arteries and veins. This was empirical, verifiable, human anatomy.
But by the Roman period, those unique texts and the practice of dissection were banned.
Yes. The loss of those specific empirical Alexandrian anatomical texts meant that when the later great physician Galen wrote his canonical works, he was forced to rely on the dissection of animals: pigs, apes, goats.
And Galen became the unquestioned medical authority for the Western and Islamic worlds for over a millennium.
But he built his authority on a flawed foundation. Because he extrapolated animal anatomy to humans, his errors, like his theory that the liver was the source of blood, persisted for 1,400 years, until Vesalius dared to resume human dissection in the Renaissance. The empirical corrective data from Herophilus and Erastratus had simply vanished.
A profound medical regression. We've established the loss in science and engineering, but the literary catastrophe, the sheer volume of narrative, poetry, and philosophy lost, is perhaps the hardest to mentally process.
The scale is almost unthinkable. When scholars apply modern statistical models, like the unseen species methodology, to the existing fragments, comparing known authors cited in surviving texts like the Suda or the remnants of the Pinakies, the findings are devastating.
What's the estimate?
The consensus estimate is that only about 1% of ancient Greek literature has survived to the present day.
Only 1%. We have lost 99% of the written cultural output of classical Greece.
It's a true statistical void. Consider the great genre of Greek tragedy. We revere Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Together, they wrote hundreds of plays. Sophocles alone wrote over 120 plays.
And how many survive in full today?
Only 33 in total. 7 by Sophocles. We are basing our entire understanding of this foundational art form on less than 10% of the available material.
We assume we have the full story of the myths and heroes, but we are often relying on secondary summaries.
Absolutely. Take the Trojan War. We have Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but the story was told in an entire sequence of epic poems called the epic cycle, including works like the Cypria and the Little Iliad.
And these covered the whole story.
Everything from the marriage of Achilles' parents to the final sacking of Troy. All of these are entirely lost, surviving only in brief, dry summaries written by later grammarians.
What's a specific example of cultural depth we lost in that void?
Think about Sophocles' breakout play, Triptolemus. It won him his first victory over Aeschylus in 468 BC. It dramatized the mythical figure who traveled the world on a winged chariot teaching humanity agriculture. The loss of this play is crucial because it obscures the early development of Sophocles' style, his thematic engagement with the origins of Greek civilization, and its early use of dramatic spectacle. We have a foundational gap in our understanding of the most influential playwright in Western history.
And the Mausian also collected knowledge that was not strictly Greek. The loss of those non-Hellenic voices is equally profound.
Yes, it locks us into a Greek-centric view of the ancient world. The case of Berossus is paramount. He was a Babylonian priest who lived around 290 BC and wrote the Babylonica in Greek, specifically to explain the deep history of Mesopotamia to the new Hellenistic rulers.
He was trying to bridge two enormous cultural traditions.
And his full text is lost. It only survives in fragments quoted by later chroniclers like Josephus and Eusebius, who often filtered his content to serve their own narratives.
So without Berossus's full text, the West was deprived of an authentic history of Babylon.
We were forced to rely on often distorted accounts from Herodotus and the Bible until the 19th century decipherment of cuneiform finally unlocked the source material again. The library held that key, and we lost it.
This tragic decline culminates in the final great mind of the Alexandrian tradition, Hypatia. She truly represents the end of the classical scientific age in Alexandria.
Hypatia, who lived from about 360 to 415 CE, was a philosopher and mathematician. She wasn't just a relic of the past, she was an active, editing, teaching force in a collapsing intellectual world.
And her most important work was in preserving and clarifying the complex foundational texts of her field.
She wrote essential commentaries on 2 massive works. First, Diophantus's Arithmetica, which is foundational to algebraic thinking. Her editing is believed to be incorporated directly into the surviving copies we have today.
She preserved it for us.
In a way, yes. And her commentary on Apollonius's conics, the study of ellipses and parabolas, was vital. Apollonius's work was dense, but it became essential for future astronomers like Kepler, who used the mathematics of ellipses to describe planetary orbits.
And her circle wasn't just bookish. They were actively engaged in empirical applied science.
We have compelling evidence from her student, Synesius of Cyrene. He wrote a fascinating letter to Hypatia requesting her to construct a specific scientific instrument for him, a hydroscope or hydrometer.
What did he need her to build?
He described it meticulously. A cylindrical tube with notches in a perpendicular line designed to test the specific gravity, the weight of water. This confirms that Hypatia and her students were actively involved in designing, fabricating, and using precision scientific instruments based on Archimedean principles well into the 5th century.
They were makers, not just readers.
Exactly.
Her eventual murder in 415 CE by a Christian mob is often cited as the definitive tragic closing act. It was intolerance and violence, not a fire, that finally extinguished the classical light in Alexandria.
The narrative of the Great Library has been defined by sorrow and loss for nearly 2 millennia. But what is truly hopeful and paradoxical about this deep dive is that we are now living in an age of technological reversal. We are using 21st century science to recover texts that were thought to be permanently destroyed.
This is a paradigm shift. The most famous early example of this digital archaeology is the Archimedes palimpsest.
A palimpsest is a parchment that has been scraped clean and written over. In this case, priceless mathematical treatises by Archimedes were erased, and the parchment was rewritten with a Byzantine prayer book.
Erasing genius to write piety.
The irony is inescapable.
And how did researchers manage to read the original faint text that had been scraped away?
Through multispectral imaging. The process uses different wavelengths of light, including ultraviolet and infrared, to penetrate the overlying layer of ink. The original ink, often iron gall-based, leaves trace elements that fluoresce or absorb light differently, allowing software to reconstruct the erased geometry.
And what lost work did this digital process reveal?
It revealed the method of mechanical theorems, a work thought lost forever. The content was profound. It proved that Archimedes was using infinitesimals, a precursor to integral calculus, to calculate the volume of complex shapes.
He effectively invented a form of calculus 1,800 years before Newton and Leibniz formalized it. The knowledge was there, waiting beneath a layer of religious text.
The loss here was not physical destruction, but deliberate erasure, and the discovery demonstrates how much we might have lost simply through reuse of materials.
The challenges associated with the Archimedes palimpsest pale in comparison to the work being done on the Herculaneum scrolls.
Oh, absolutely. These are the only surviving complete library from antiquity.
Buried by Vesuvius.
The eruption in 79 CE carbonized the papyri, essentially baking them into brittle charcoal rolls. For centuries, the attempt to open them meant shattering them into useless fragments.
This challenge is now being tackled by the Vesuvius challenge, using a combination of physics and AI. How are they managing to read these scrolls without opening them?
It's an extraordinary technological stack. First, they use computed tomography, CT scanning, at particle accelerators to create incredibly high-resolution X-ray scans of the tightly rolled layers.
But the ink was also carbon-based, meaning it's visually invisible inside the carbonized paper.
Exactly. The key is artificial intelligence. Researchers trained AI algorithms to detect the subtle, microscopic differences in the texture and density caused by the ink. The ink sits slightly differently on the surface, and the algorithms can isolate and map that.
And this painstaking high-tech effort has already started to yield results in the last year.
Yes. In late 2023, the first full word was decoded, porphyros, or purple. Then, in early 2024, about 5% of one scroll was deciphered, revealing a philosophical treatise by Philodemus discussing how to enjoy pleasures in life.
The significance of this breakthrough is immense because it promises to unlock thousands of books.
This is the literal digital excavation of a lost library. Researchers estimate that this technology, once perfected, could unlock thousands of scrolls, potentially doubling the entire corpus of surviving ancient Greek literature.
We may recover entire sections of the Library of Alexandria, or at least its intellectual equivalent.
It's a real possibility.
And this age of retrieval isn't limited to texts. We're recovering lost material science, too.
A fantastic modern application. MIT researchers studying Roman marine concrete, the material that allowed them to build durable harbors that have survived 2,000 years of seawater erosion, discovered the secret was hot mixing using quicklime.
How does quicklime contribute to this durability?
Hot mixing created what they called lime clasts, tiny, highly reactive chunks of quicklime within the structure. The crucial insight is that these clasts allow the concrete to self-heal. When seawater infiltrates tiny cracks, the lime clasts react with the water, dissolving and recrystallizing as calcium carbonate, which seals a crack.
Modern concrete often fails because it's brittle. Roman concrete was designed to perpetually repair itself.
We have literally recovered lost material science that far surpasses our current standard for longevity.
So if we synthesize our findings from this deep dive, the true story of the Library of Alexandria is far more complex and perhaps more poignant than the simple myth of a single burning.
The burning was a systemic, centuries-long decline, a perfect storm where political instability, military conflict, shifting cultural priorities, and economic stagnation all conspired to dismantle one of the world's greatest institutions piece by piece. The mountain didn't die instantly, it withered.
The crucial structural truth we uncovered, the counterfactual analysis, is that knowledge, even at its most revolutionary, is insufficient by itself. Heron's steam engine remained a parlor trick, not just because the texts were eventually lost, but because the ancient economy lacked the structural incentive, the capital, and the fuel infrastructure to implement the revolution.
The failure was economic before it was intellectual.
But the incredible conclusion to this journey is the technological reversal. We are now living in a new age of Alexandria. Through digital forensics, multispectral imaging, and AI, we are physically and conceptually excavating the very calculus, philosophy, and astronomy that were mourned as irrevocably lost for millennia.
We are proving that geometry, complex theory, and profound human thought can be retrieved from the dust and the carbon.
Which raises a final provocative question for you, the listener, to mull over. We have spent centuries mourning the knowledge that vanished. Now that we are beginning to retrieve advanced science and philosophy thought lost forever, what fundamental world-changing discoveries might still be locked away in the fragments we have yet to digitally read?
And perhaps more importantly,
What modern structural, economic, or cultural biases might be preventing us from fully understanding and applying that knowledge, even when we find it?
the library teaches us that history is not just about what was preserved, but who had the incentive to read, understand, and apply the knowledge that survived.
An excellent thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.